The first discussion topic on today's Peace and Prosperity is Pyongyang's motives for carrying out its 12th projectile test this year against a backdrop of North Korea-US dialogue. A day after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un sent his condolences over the death of President Moon Jae-in's mother, North Korea test-fired 2 projectiles, presumed to be super-large multiple rocket launcher. The latest provocation comes amid increased bellicose rhetoric against the U.S. from Pyongyang after the breakdown of Stockholm working-level talks. How far will North Korea go to push the U.S. to come up with a new approach by the year-end deadline? Will it be able to get what it wants through the pressure offensive? Today's second discussion topic is Washington's intentions behind strengthening unilateral sanctions on Pyongyang, despite the continued bilateral dialogue. The U.S. State Department imposed a record number of 12 sanctions on North Korea in 2018, when relations between the two sides dramatically improved. Is this part of U.S.'s strategy to bring the North back to the negotiating table? Meanwhile, North Korea is responding to America's sanctions with armed provocations. Will the two sides be able to find a middle ground by the end of this year? To shed light on these latest developments, our host, Bong Young-sik, Research Fellow at Yonsei University's Institute for North Korean Studies, is joined by Kim Jina, Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. To broaden the perspective, we also connect with guest experts on Skype, including Henry Ferren, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy, and Ankit Panda, Senior Editor at the Diplomat magazine.
Hello and welcome to Peace and Prosperity. Ever since North Korea-US dialogue began, following the History Inter-Korean Summit in Panmunjom last April, the two sides have locked themselves into a cycle of provocations and sanctions. What repeats the pattern of provocations and sanctions against the backdrop of dialogue? Joining with us to go in-depth analysis on the latest developments is Dr. Kim Jina, Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. Welcome to our program, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. It's really nice to see you again.
Right. Always a pleasure to have you here. North Korea once again test fire projectiles in the backdrop of sending condolences to President Moon Jae-in of South Korea for the loss of his mother. What do you make of this rather confusing pattern of behavior by North Korea?
Well, North Korea has always separated two issues, inter-Korean relations and denuclearization talks. So that's why we're seeing so ambivalent attitude toward South Korea. And it seems to me that North Korea knows where the threshold of U.S. reaction is drawn. It is no ICBM test or no nuclear test. And there was no action taken by the UN Security Council, even against SRBM test and also SLBM test. I think SLBM test was very close to the threshold of, triggering UN reaction. But anyway, if North Korea has its own timetable to develop this new type of weapon system, then we can see continuation of testing in the future.
As a threshold that the United States seems to not mind as long as the ICBM test by North Korea are not kind of a test that would reach the United States. In that regard, would you put accountability or blame on the shoulders of the White House in the United States?
Well, I think President Trump helps the leadership in Pyongyang to create a new normal, a new situation.
What is a new normal here?
It's a new situation that we should adapt to, which is different from the past. And North Korea is trying to set up a new kind of environment so that it can have more deterrence internally, and it can also join the regional arms race, especially. So if the regional arms race and a great power competition is going on, especially between the US and China, well, North Korea can find itself in a situation where it can join the club safely.
So are we going to be numb and increasingly desensitized to numerous test firings of the short and intermediate range missiles by North Korea? That's new normal?
Well, we have to be prepared for that, actually.
Okay,
Yes.
right. Now we'll hear observations from the U.S. on this matter. Joining us on the line is Henry Ferren, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Hello, Dr. Ferren.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me on the show. It's an honor.
Right. I'd like to ask you about two contrasting opinions in the United States. Clark Cooper, U.S. Assistant Secretary for State for Political Military Affairs, denounced North Korea's third test firing of multiple rocket launchers this year, adding it will adversely affect North Korea-U.S. dialogue. On the other hand, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo downplayed the significance of the firing, saying it's consistent with what the North has done before. Which opinion do you side with?
So whether North Korea's short-range tests will adversely affect negotiations depends on the attitude that the U.S. chooses to take. And in this case, Pompeo's word overrides that of Cooper. Pompeo's Secretary of State, Cooper is just Assistant Secretary, so it's reasonable to assume that the U.S. will not make an issue out of the short-range tests. Now, the reason why the U.S. ignores this test goes back to the Singapore summit of June 2018. There, Kim Jong-un and Trump appeared to have informally agreed that North Korea would refrain from long-range missile tests if the U.S. refrained from joint military exercises with South Korea. It's a confidence-building measure, sometimes referred to as freeze for freeze. A few months later, though, it became clear that the U.S. and South Korea would continue joint exercises under another name, and that's when North Korea started to conduct a lot of short-range tests. And the Trump administration chose not to make an issue out of it. They may have been acknowledging the breaking of a promise, and they wanted to preserve at least the long-range moratorium. So we went from a freeze for freeze to what I call a tolerate for tolerate. North Korea tolerates the joint exercises, and the U.S. tolerates the short-range tests in order to preserve dialogue and the long-range moratorium.
Dr. Ferren, the U.S. Special Envoy to North Korea, Mr. Steve Biegun, has been tapped as the next Deputy Secretary of State. Do you think it is positive for the U.S. DPRK talks in the future, or do you think it can be sidelined away from other pressing foreign policy issues?
So Biegun is widely respected in the foreign policy community, and his openness to the concept of an interim deal with North Korea, and this indicates to me that he understands the issue much better than those who pushed for an all-or-nothing approach. All or nothing makes no sense in 2019. North Korea is not about to surrender, and we need a more modest approach that focuses on ending hostilities and stopping the development of the North Korean nuclear program. And Biegun's the best candidate for this shift. Now, I don't think that Biegun will get sidetracked by his new duties. He said he wants to keep the North Korea dossier, and I believe he has made it his personal mission to get a deal with Pyongyang. He has previously turned down the honor of becoming U.S. ambassador to Russia in order to stay in charge of North Korea. That's even though he's originally a Russia specialist. So his promotion is positive because it will give him the authority he needs to negotiate with the North Koreans. The North Koreans were originally not particularly interested in talking to him because they believed he had no real decision-making power. The man that we're looking to and criticizing was Pompeo. And they call Pompeo the poisonous plant of U.S. diplomacy, right? Now that Biegun is deputy, he can tell the North Koreans that he will soon replace Pompeo. And indeed, there are rumors that Pompeo will leave the State Department to run for the Senate back in his home state of Kansas, and he's already done 4 trips to Kansas this year. So Biegun's promotion opens a lot of possibilities.
Let's talk about domestic politics of the United States. We are 1 year away from 2020 presidential election in the United States, and polls showing increasing support for President Trump's impeachment. Do you think these events will affect nuclear talks with North Korea?
The impeachment proceedings could undermine the potential for a deal with North Korea. First, by distracting the president, Second, by making it more politically risky for the president to enter into deals with controversial figures such as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So not all Democrats have opposed the engagement with North Korea, but many have vocally criticized the Trump administration's summit diplomacy. And some may also want revenge, really, for Trump's scuttling of Obama's Iran deal. That said, the danger that impeachment proceedings poses to U.S.-North Korea diplomacy should not be overstated. Trump may be distracted, but he can delegate more of that dossier to Biden, given the promotion. Moreover, the impeachment proceedings are very unlikely to end with the removal of Trump. Removal would require 2/3 of the Senate. The Senate currently has a majority of Republicans, and they are likely to stick together in an election year. So I believe Trump has enough leeway for a deal with North Korea, if he wants one.
Right, Dr. Henry Ferren, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Thank you so much for sharing your insight today.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Right, Dr. Kim, I'd like to hear your overall response to Dr. Ferren's assessment of the situation. In particular, the former North Korean diplomat, Mr. Tae-yong said something very different. North Koreans believe that they can take President Trump on the ropes because of the domestic challenges, which is very different from what Dr. Ferren says, that there's no real strong connection between domestic political situations and Trump being soft on North Korea. What do you think of all these issues?
Well, I think, first of all, North Korea will welcome the fact that Mr. Biden has a higher position, because that means whom they're dealing with can have more authority than before and more power, and that means more leverage and flexibility.
They might send a congratulations letter to Mr. Biden.
Right. Actually, the history told us that North Koreans love to meet people from higher rank, right,
Okay.
rather than lower rank. So that's a positive sign for North Korea. And with regard to Trump's approach to North Korea, I think just keeping the status quo, that situation is just enough for President Trump. Because the worst scenario is North Korea's major provocation that can interfere with his re-election campaign. So as long as there is no major nuclear test or ICBM test, I think President Trump will just be happy about the situation now.
But Chairman Kim Jong-un set the self-imposed deadline by the end of this year. United States has come up with creative solutions. So what is likely to happen?
Well, actually, the reason why the Hanoi summit failed was there is a huge gap between the U.S. and the DPRK in their positions on the definition of denuclearization. How to denuclearize North Korea, they have no agreement on that. And we have not seen any evidence to show that North Korea has changed its mind. Right after the meeting in Stockholm, North Koreans said that they were very disappointed about the fact that there was no change in U.S. positions. And that means North Korea has no intention to change their own positions as well. So as long as there is a gap between the two sides, I think even though we have working level talk, the outcome may be very, very negative.
And the clock keeps ticking, right,
Yes.
toward the end of this year. One of the reasons we can't downplay North Korea's provocations is that the regime's weapon capabilities are growing by the day, amid a muted response from the U.S. and the rest of the international community. Here's a short clip.
North Korea announced on October 31st that it successfully tested a super-large multiple rocket launcher from the western city of Suncheon towards the East Sea. This is the third time this year that the North had tested a super-large multiple rocket launcher, following the test in August and September. Unlike the previous two tests, North Korea boasted the latest launch, saying it verified the combat performance and perfection of the firing system.
이번 시험 사격을 통하여 면석 사격 체계의 완벽성까지 검증됨으로써 초대형 방사포 무기 체계의 기습적인 타격으로 적의 집단 목표나 지정된 목표 구역을 초강력으로 초토화할 수 있게 되었습니다.
The launcher North Korea fired last week had a similar range and apogee to the ones used in the previous two tests. However, the projectiles were fired consecutively within 3 minutes apart, less than the previous 17 and 19 minutes, which is a testament to the North's efforts to improve the continuous fire system. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo downplayed the significance of Pyongyang's recent firing, saying it's consistent with what the regime has done before. While some expect more test firings by North Korea in coming weeks, it remains to be seen how much the U.S. will tolerate the North's provocations.
Dr. Kim, compared to the test firing of the similar super large missile launcher that North Korea tested in September, after 2 months in November, this one is even upgraded version of a super large multiple rocket launcher. How threatening are these?
Well, North Korea's development of artillery system goes back to former Soviet Union era. They have a long history of developing that kind of system. Well, compared to the missiles, artillery is very easy to be loaded and easy to be fired, but it is inferior in the range and precision and also firepower. But the new system that North Korea is testing these days shows that it has precision-guided capability, longer range, and precision, and also firepower.
Okay.
So I'm very much concerned about the possibility that North Korea can mass-produce this type of system and deploy in the field. If that happens, I think it can cause very devastating violence to the major portion of the population in South Korea.
I see. Just as North Korea launched a string of provocations, the U.S. continued to use sanctions to pressure the North. When the North Korea-U.S. rapprochement reached new heights last year, the U.S. imposed even more unilateral sanctions than any other time in history. Here's more on the story.
The U.S. imposed a record number of sanctions on North Korea in 2018, when bilateral relations saw a dramatic turnaround, including the first ever summit between the leaders of the two sides. According to the 2018 Digest of United States Practice in International Law, recently published by the U.S. State Department, America placed a total of 12 unilateral sanctions on the North last year. Washington continued its campaign of pressure and sanctions against the regime throughout the year, except from April to July, when dialogue was underway between the two. Out of the 29 individuals on the sanctions list, 24 were North Korean nationals. Among the 53 sanctioned entities, 30 were North Korean companies. The 12 sanctions primarily focused on the North's illegal maritime activities, with 5 sanctions imposed on ship-to-ship transfers of goods that were banned by the UN, including oil and coal. They also targeted illicit financial activities to fund the regime's illegal weapons program, cyber attacks, flow of foreign currency through information technology, and trade of banned arms and luxury goods. The U.S. has strengthened its sanctions on the North despite the dialogue momentum. How has the sanctions campaign affected the Pyongyang-Washington talks?
Dr. Kim, if I were a member of North Korean authority, I might be confused because it's like a double dealing by the U.S. government. On one hand, it has imposed numerous economic sanctions, the most number of sanctions in history. On the other hand, President saying that he is in best relationship with the supreme authority of North Korea and he's fond of dialogue. So is it kind of a Trump style of art of dealing with North Korea?
Well, currently the U.S. sanctions on North Korea is led by Treasury and Justice Department. So they're doing their job, closing the loopholes in the existing sanctions regime and responding to any non-compliance, regardless of the talks between the U.S. and the DPRK. And the current sanctions on the DPRK was caused not just by, missile test or a nuclear test. It's caused by other issues, human rights violations, cyber attack, money laundering, and many others. So even though we have a negotiation on denuclearization, sanctions will be the same. And lastly, I should say that the President Trump and many others also believe that sanctions is their leverage to keep North Korea at the negotiation table. Yes.
Right. To find out how the effectiveness of sanctions on North Korea is viewed in the U.S., we connect with Ankit Panda, senior editor at the Diplomat magazine. Hello.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here.
Welcome to the program. The United States has continued to impose sanctions on the North against the backdrop of dialogue. From North Korea's standpoint, could this be seen as a double dealing, which makes it less inclined to denuclearize?
I think so. I think generally the North Koreans view new sanctions actions by the United States or the international community against them as an act of illegitimate aggression. They regard the entire international sanctions regime as illegitimate. For example, just as we regard their missile testing to be contrary to the spirit of negotiations, they regard new sanctions actions. So the United States has taken new actions, including the extension of the travel ban on American citizens towards North Korea that was extended during the period of rapprochement. But also President Trump did actually intervene to prevent the imposition of new sanctions measures immediately after the Hanoi summit. It was unclear why exactly he was doing that or what exactly the sanctions would have been had he not taken that step. But some commentators have argued that that, in effect, amounts to passive sort of sanctions relief, that North Korea might actually have seen more sanctions than it did while it was talking to the United States.
Do you think Washington's unilateral sanctions are an effective tool to pressure Pyongyang or to deter its nuclear programs?
I think the historical record is quite clear at this point on the ability of sanctions to change the North Korean regime's decision-making on the value of nuclear weapons. And the answer is, I think it's quite a poor tool to influence the regime's decision-making. Of course, sanctions can do many things. They do impose costs on North Korea. There's a reason that North Korea made sanctions relief the primary ask at the failed Hanoi summit, for example, in February. It's because they care about sanctions. They want sanctions relief. However, they're not willing to put their nuclear weapons on the table to get that sanctions relief. That has been the theory of American diplomacy towards North Korea for a long time now, that if we apply enough sanctions pressure, at some point, North Korea will decide that the benefits of sanctions relief will outweigh the benefits that it derives from its nuclear weapons. But I think we fail to understand that the benefits that North Korea derives from its nuclear weapons are effectively limitless because it guarantees the survival of the regime, something that is very difficult to put a price on. So I don't think that we'll see the regime change its decision-making about the value of nuclear weapons per se, but that's not to say that sanctions can't have any value in diplomacy. That's where I think sanctions relief needs to come in.
Mr. Ankit Panda, senior editor at the Diplomat, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on sanctions on North Korea.
Thank you. Yeah, talk to you anytime. Goodbye.
All right, bye-bye. Dr. Kim, your opinions on sanctions and Mr. Panda's analysis?
Well, my personal opinion is, I'm worried about the fact that there are many countries contributing to sanctions busting, meaning that there are many who are providing or helping North Korea roundabout ways to avoid sanctions on the regime. So we have to actually deal with that issue globally. And when it comes to the utility of UN sanctions, we may have at least 3 different objectives: naming and shaming, constraining the behaviors, and also changing the behaviors in a way that we want to see. With regard to the first objective, naming and shaming, we have done it. It was successfully implemented by many. But when it comes to the second objective of constraining North Korea's behavior, well, we have some partial success on that regard because we have strengthened the existing export control regime targeting North Korea. So by doing so, we have seen that North Korea's partners in strategic trade has changed dramatically. But when it comes to the third objective, I think lots of work should be done because, well, changing North Korea's behavior is making North Korea to agree on denuclearization. We are not there yet.
Well, I'd like to remind you that we are only less than 2 months away from the end of the calendar year 2019. And comparing to the very positive start at the beginning of the year 2018, and very good year in 2019, except for the breakdown of the Hanoi Summit meeting between US and North Korea, the mood on the Korean Peninsula and the North Korea's denuclearization has been on a positive note, more or less. What do you see after the end of this year?
North Korea set a deadline by the end of this year because 2020 is a very critical year for the leadership in Pyongyang because there is a deadline to accomplish its a 5-year economic plan.
Right.
So in 2020, North Korea should evaluate their achievement for the last 5 years. So year 2020 is important on that regard. And it is possible that Chairman Kim wants to make an announcement as part of his New Year's speech on the first day of 2020, saying that its relationship with the US has been improved dramatically. So that's in that way, he can actually show better and brighter future for the North Koreans. I think that's the key political objective that the leadership in Pyongyang is pursuing. However, as I told you before, the US government has a different timeline, right? So as long as President Trump is satisfied with the status quo situation at this point, well, until the gap between the US and the DPRK in their understanding about the goal of denuclearization talks, well, if that gap is not narrowed down, then we are going to see a continuation of a stalemated situation.
I see. All right, Dr. Kim, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today. And I'd very much like to invite you back at the beginning of next year, 2020, probably in the aftermath of the announcement of Kim Jong-un's New Year's message to the nation.
I look forward to that.
All right, I would be very much interested in listening to your analysis. And that is all we have for you today. We'll be back next week with more Korean Peninsular issues. Thanks for watching. Peace and prosperity.